My step-granddaughter sat across from me in my own living room, folded her hands like she was closing a business deal and said, "We've filed a petition to determine your capacity, Philip. It's for your own protection." She didn't flinch. She didn't hesitate. She spoke like someone who had already decided who I was and what I was no longer capable of deciding for myself. What she didn't know, what no one in that room knew, was that 31 years ago, I was the prosecutor who trained the investigator assigned to her case. My name is Philip Carver. For 32 years, I served as a deputy district attorney in this county, prosecuting fraud, elder abuse, and the occasional homicide. I trained a generation of investigators, taught them how to build cases that could withstand any cross-examination. Now I'm 71 years old, a widower, living in the same house my wife and I bought 40 years ago. And my step-granddaughter is telling a judge that I can no longer manage my own affairs. The central question isn't whether I'm competent. It's whether the system I gave my life to will see the truth before my family takes everything. I should start at the beginning. I met Alina in 1989 at the courthouse. She was a court reporter with quick hands and a quicker mind, and I was a 39-year-old deputy district attorney who had already decided I'd never marry. She changed that. She had a daughter from her first marriage, Patricia, 16 years old and skeptical of me from the start. Patricia grew up, married a man named James Holcomb, and gave birth to a daughter in 2002. They named her Lillian. That makes Lillian my step-granddaughter. I was at the hospital the day she was born, and from that moment I loved her without hesitation. For the next 18 years, our lives were ordinary and good. Alina and I bought this house in 1993, a 4-bedroom Craftsman on Maple Street with a wraparound porch and an oak tree in the front yard. We filled it with bookshelves and Sunday dinners and the noise of Lillian running through the hallway. Patricia and James divorced when Lillian was 12, and she spent even more weekends here. I taught her to ride a bike. I helped her with her history papers. When she graduated high school, I gave a speech at her party. I called her my granddaughter because in every way that mattered, she was. Then Alina got sick, pancreatic cancer. It moved fast. She died in July of 2021, and the house went quiet in a way that still hasn't fully lifted. Patricia moved to Arizona the following year. Lillian was 19, in college an hour away, and she became more present. I took that as a kindness. She'd bring groceries, sit with me through the evening news, ask if I was eating properly. I thought grief had given us a new closeness. I was wrong. The first sign came in the fall of 2022. Lillian mentioned that I had forgotten a lunch date we hadn't actually made. I let it go. Everyone forgets things. Then she started asking about my finances. Was I keeping up with bills? Did I remember to pay the property taxes? She asked gently, the way you'd ask a child if they'd tied their own shoes. Around the same time, she recommended I see a doctor she knew, a neurologist. Just a checkup, Grandpa, she said. I'd never been called forgetful by anyone in my professional life. I'd cross-examined murderers without notes, but I agreed to be polite. The neurologist found nothing wrong. Lillian seemed almost disappointed. By the spring of 2023, the suggestions had shifted into something sharper. She began telling other family members that I was slipping. My elder sister called me, concerned, repeating things Lillian had told her, that I'd left the stove on, that I'd gotten lost driving home. Neither of those things had happened, but lies spread faster than corrections. I started documenting everything. I wrote down dates, conversations, the exact words she used. Old habit. I'd spent 3 decades building cases from paper trails. In June, Lillian showed up at my door with legal documents, a durable power of attorney. She said it was just a precaution, that we should have it in place before anything happened. Her husband, a financial planner named Derek, whom I'd never quite trusted, stood beside her nodding. I told them I would review it with my own attorney. They left angry. 2 days later, I told them I would not sign. Lillian called me paranoid. She said I was becoming a danger to myself. She used those words exactly, a danger to yourself. I know legal phrasing when I hear it. That language comes straight from the probate code, the standard for involuntary guardianship. Somebody had been coaching her. 4 weeks ago, A sheriff's deputy knocked on my door and handed me a petition. Lillian Holcomb had filed to have me declared incapacitated. She claimed I could no longer manage my property, my health care, or my financial decisions. She was asking the court to appoint her as my guardian. The petition listed examples of my supposed decline, dates when I'd allegedly failed to pay bills, instances of confusion I'd never experienced. It was a story carefully constructed, and I recognized the architecture of it immediately. Someone had built a case. I hired an attorney, a woman named Helen Rankin, who had once clerked for the judge I most respected. She reviewed the petition and told me it was flimsy, full of hearsay and unsupported assertions. But she also said the court would appoint an investigator to evaluate me. That investigator would interview witnesses, review my records, and write a report that would carry enormous weight with the judge. I wasn't worried. I had lived my life above reproach. I had documentation. I had clarity. And then I saw the name signed at the bottom of the court's appointment order. The investigator assigned to my case was Mark Devereaux. Mark Devereaux, who I trained from a 26-year-old rookie into the sharpest investigator in the county. Mark Devereaux, who sat across from me in 100 depositions, who ate dinner at my table, who cried in my office the night his own father died. I hadn't spoken to him in 7 years, not since he transferred to the Elder Affairs Division. And now he was being sent to decide whether I was fit to live as a free man. I opened my notebook and began writing down everything I knew about him, every case we'd worked, every vulnerability, every debt I might call in. Because if the man I once mentored had become my judge, I needed to know exactly who he really was. I had trained Mark Devereaux from the day he walked into the office, 22 years old, fresh out of the academy, still carrying the faint eagerness of someone who had not yet learned what people were capable of. He was the son of a steelworker, quiet but observant, and within his first year I had put him on 3 elder fraud cases that went to trial. He had a gift for noticing what others missed, a hesitation in a witness, a discrepancy in a bank statement that looked like nothing but turned into everything. By the time he was 30, he had closed more cases than any investigator in the county, and I had written 2 letters of commendation that went into his personnel file. He called me a mentor. He said I had shaped the kind of investigator he became. Now he was arriving at my house on Tuesday morning to decide whether I could keep my own front door key. I spent the weekend preparing, not obsessively but thoroughly. I pulled old photographs from the years of leaner and I hosted summer cookouts. Mark was in several of them, holding a paper plate, laughing beside a grill, the same man who now carried a court order with my name on it. I organized my financial records into labeled folders: bank statements, tax returns, property tax receipts, the deed to the house. I found the letter from the neurologist confirming there was no cognitive impairment. I made a list of contact numbers for every friend, neighbor, and former colleague who could attest to my competence. And then I sat at my kitchen table and wrote down the single most important thing I knew about Mark Devereaux. 7 years earlier, he had made a mistake. Not a crime, but a misjudgment that could have ended his career. He was lead investigator on a case involving a real estate developer accused of defrauding elderly homeowners. The developer, a man named Vincent Aldridge, was a master of paper trails that led nowhere. Mark, under pressure from a new supervising attorney who wanted faster results, had signed off on a warrant affidavit that contained an error, a date that didn't match the underlying evidence. Defense counsel noticed. The warrant was challenged, the evidence nearly suppressed, and the entire case nearly collapsed. The supervising attorney threw Mark under the testimony at the suppression hearing. Mark was publicly humiliated. For a year afterward, he was assigned to the lowest level cases, the ones no one wanted, and people around the office whispered that his career was over. I was the one who pulled him out of it. I went to the chief deputy and argued that Mark had been scapegoated, that the error was the attorney's, not his, and that removing him from major cases was wasting one of the sharpest minds in the division. I put my own credibility behind him. Within 6 months, He was back on complex investigations. He told me at the time that I had saved him. I told him he had saved himself, and I meant it. But I also knew that what I had given him was more than a second chance. I had given him a debt, and I had never asked him to repay it, until now. The question I sat with on that Sunday night was simple. Did Mark Devereaux remember? And if he did, would it matter? The court's appointment order gave him enormous discretion. He was tasked with evaluating my mental status, my living conditions, my financial management, and my overall fitness. His report would go directly to Judge Margaret Ellison, who had presided over guardianship cases for 16 years and who, I knew from my own time in the courthouse, was decisive and did not tolerate gamesmanship. If Mark's report said I was incapable, I would have an uphill battle. If it said I was capable, Lillian's petition would collapse. The entire case rested on his judgment. He arrived at 9 in the morning on Tuesday, October 10th. I saw his car pull up from my front window, a gray sedan, government issue, the same kind of car he'd driven when we worked cases together. He stepped out wearing a dark jacket over a blue button-down, no tie, carrying a leather bag that looked worn at the corners. He stood at the curb for a long moment and looked up at my house, at the wraparound porch, at the oak tree, at the house where he had once eaten barbecue and laughed with my late wife. Then he walked to the door and knocked. I opened it. We looked at each other for perhaps 3 seconds. He had aged. His hair was thinner, grayer, and the lines around his eyes were deeper. But his expression was unreadable in a way it had never been when he was young. Back then, Mark's face was an open book. Now he had learned to close it. "Mr. Carver," he said. Not Philip, not Phil, Mr. Carver. I understood immediately. He was drawing a boundary between the past and the present, between the friendship and the file folder he was carrying in his bag. I appreciated the honesty of it. It told me, right away, that this was not going to be easy. "Come in, Mark," I said, and I used his first name deliberately, not to provoke but to remind. He didn't react. I led him to the living room where I had set 2 chairs facing each other across the coffee table. I had placed a jug of water and 2 glasses there, nothing more. I didn't offer coffee. I didn't want to perform hospitality that would be interpreted as performance. We sat. He opened his bag and removed a notepad, a digital recorder, and a thick folder with my name printed on the tab. "I'm required to tell you this conversation is being recorded," he said. "It's standard procedure for these evaluations." "I know the procedure," I said. "I wrote some of it." He met my eyes then briefly, and something flickered behind them, a recognition maybe or a regret. Then it was gone. He pressed record. The interview lasted 2 hours. He asked me questions from a standard assessment protocol: orientation to time and place, awareness of current events, recall of a short list of words, understanding of my financial obligations, my daily routines, my medications. I answered each one calmly and accurately. He asked about the last time I'd driven a car, and I told him I had driven myself to a doctor's appointment 5 days earlier without incident. He asked if I prepared my own meals, and I described the pork chops I'd cooked the previous evening. He asked about my will, my estate plan, and my advance directive, and I told him the exact date each document had been updated and which attorney had prepared them. Through all of it, he took notes. His face stayed neutral, but I noticed something that a less trained observer might have missed. Each time I gave a precise, articulate answer, the pace of his writing increased almost imperceptibly. He was not just recording information. He was, I suspected, building a record of competence for the file he would later write. That was the first sign of hope. Then he asked the hard questions. He brought up the allegations from Lillian's petition, the stove I had supposedly left on, the bills I had supposedly forgotten, the times I had allegedly gotten lost. I addressed each one directly. "The stove incident never happened," I said. "There is no record of a gas company visit, no fire department call, no neighbor who can corroborate it. Ask Lillian to produce even one piece of evidence." "The utility bills," he said, reading from his notes. "The petition states that your water was shut off in March of this year for non-payment." I stood up, walked to my desk in the corner of the room, and returned with a folder. I opened it and handed him a single sheet of paper, my March water bill, stamped paid on March 5th. The water was never shut off. I have every bill from the last 3 years, all paid on time. You can verify with the water department. He looked at the page. He wrote something in his notebook. Then he looked up at me, and for the first time his expression shifted. Not dramatically, but I saw it, something around his jaw loosening. The investigation was, in that moment, beginning to diverge from the petition's version of reality. But here is what I did not know then. While Mark was sitting in my living room asking questions, Lillian was across town having lunch with Derek and an attorney I hadn't yet heard of, a woman named Clarissa Webb, who specialized in high-asset guardianship cases. They were reviewing strategy, and they were waiting for Mark's preliminary report. And they had a backup plan I hadn't anticipated. Mark finished his interview and packed up his bag. He stood by the front door with his hand on the knob, and he hesitated. I saw the hesitation. I filed it away. "Philip," he said very quietly, "off the record." "Off the record," I confirmed. "You should know that this isn't just about competency. The petition includes a claim that you've been dissipating assets, that you've given away money to a charity that Lillian believes is fraudulent, and that this is evidence of impaired judgment." I stared at him. "What charity?" "It's called the Hastings Veterans Outreach Foundation. The petition says you donated $18,000 to them over the last 2 years. Lillian is arguing that no competent person would give that much money to an unverified organization." I knew exactly what he was talking about. My older brother, Samuel, had served in Vietnam and died of complications from Agent Orange exposure in 2010. The Hastings Foundation provided medical support to veterans in his name. I had been donating to them for 12 years. They were a legitimate, registered nonprofit, and I had the receipts. But that wasn't what caught my attention. What caught my attention was that Lillian was now attacking not my memory or my driving, but my charitable giving, my private, deliberate, long-standing pattern of generosity that had nothing to do with impairment. She was expanding the battlefield. She was, as we used to say in my old office, building a monster argument, a claim so multi-layered that even if one piece failed, others might stick. Mark opened the door. "I'll file my report within 2 weeks. I can't tell you what it will say, but I would recommend you get your financial records in order, all of them." He left. I watched his sedan pull away. Then I walked to my study, closed the door, and began the deepest dive into my own life I had ever conducted. I pulled every bank statement, every canceled check, every tax filing for the last decade. I called the Hastings Foundation and requested a complete record of my donations and their annual reports. I contacted my attorney, Helen Rankin, and told her what Mark had revealed. And then I called a man named Arthur Penn, who had been my closest colleague in the district attorney's office for 18 years before he retired. Arthur had known Mark as well as I had. I told him what was happening. I asked him to tell me everything he knew about Mark's last 7 years, his career path, his personal life, his pressures, his loyalties. Arthur was quiet for a long moment. Then he said something that changed everything. "Philip, there's something you need to know about Mark's current situation. His wife, Catherine, has been ill, very ill, medical bills. He's been struggling. And 6 months ago, he moved out of the Elder Affairs Division and into a private consulting role. But that's not the part you need to worry about. The part you need to worry about is who his biggest client is." "Who?" "The firm of Clarissa Webb. She's the attorney representing your step-granddaughter." I set the phone down slowly. The man assigned to investigate my capacity was now a private consultant retained by the very law firm that was trying to strip me of my legal rights. The conflict of interest was not subtle. It was glaring, but the court didn't know. Helen Rankin didn't know. No one knew except Arthur Penn and now me. And I had 2 weeks before Mark Devereaux handed his report to the judge. I sat at my desk and began writing, not to defend myself this time, but to attack. Because if the investigator assigned to my case was compromised, I wasn't just fighting Lillian anymore. I was fighting a system that had been quietly rigged against me, and I needed to prove it before the trap closed completely. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in my study until 3 in the morning, the desk lamp throwing long shadows across the wall, and I did what I had done for 32 years. I built a case. The difference was that this time, the case was about me. I started with Mark Devereaux. Arthur Penn had given me the headline, but I needed the footnotes. I called a former clerk from the Elder Affairs Division, a woman named June who had retired the same year I did and who kept better records than the county archive. June confirmed that Mark had left the division in March of this year and registered as a private investigator specializing in guardianship evaluations. Within 2 months, he had taken on 6 cases. 4 of them were referred by Clarissa Webb's firm. In 3 of those 4, the court had imposed guardianship. The pattern was difficult to ignore. But June also gave me something I hadn't expected. She said Mark had initially declined Lillian's petition. The court had assigned a different investigator, a woman named Sandra Okonkwo, who had been scheduled to evaluate me. Then Sandra was removed from the case. No reason given. Mark was substituted in 3 days later. June didn't know who had made that decision, but she knew the administrative order had come from the court clerk's office, and that Clarissa Webb had called the clerk 3 times in the week before the switch. I wrote down the clerk's name, Thomas Bracken. I had once opposed Bracken for a promotion. He had not forgotten. The second thread I pulled was Clarissa Webb herself. I asked Helen Rankin to run a background check, not on her bar record, which was clean, but on her case history. What we found was a practice built almost entirely on high-asset guardianship petitions, elderly clients with significant property, relatives who wanted control quickly. Webb had filed 37 guardianship cases in the last 5 years. In 31 of them, she had succeeded. In 22, she had obtained temporary emergency guardianships within the first 2 weeks of filing, before the subject had a chance to mount a defense. Once a temporary guardian was appointed, the assets were effectively frozen, and the elderly subject had to fight from a position of financial deprivation. It was a legal siege tactic. I recognized it because I had prosecuted men who used the same playbook in a different context. Isolate the target, seize the assets, make resistance unaffordable, then wait. But the threads didn't stop there. On Thursday, my bank called. A woman from the fraud department, professional and careful, said there had been an unusual attempt to access my accounts online. Someone had used my social security number and my mother's maiden name to try to change the password on my primary checking account. The bank had flagged it and blocked it. The IP address traced back to a location in Arizona, the city where my stepdaughter Patricia lived. I called Patricia. She answered on the 3rd ring and her voice was tight, defensive before I'd said more than hello. She knew. She knew about the petition, knew about the bank attempt, knew about all of it. And she told me with a kind of rehearsed sorrow that Lillian had convinced her I was deteriorating. Lillian had sent her videos, recordings of me in my own kitchen, taken without my knowledge, edited to make ordinary pauses look like confusion. I demanded she send me the videos. She did. I watched them. They were shot through the window over my kitchen sink from the yard at times when I'd been making coffee, reading the paper, looking out at the garden. In one clip, I paused while pouring water into the coffee maker, thinking about something, and Lillian's voiceover, added later, said, "See, he forgets what he's doing mid-action." I hadn't forgotten anything. I was thinking about the coffee maker itself, which a leaner had given me for my 65th birthday and which had broken the previous week. But the video didn't show my face clearly, and the pause looked, to an outsider, like vacancy. I watched the recordings 3 times, then I sent them to Helen. She called me back within 20 minutes. This is surveillance without consent, she said. It's potentially illegal, and combined with the bank access attempt, it starts to look like a coordinated effort to manufacture evidence of incapacity. She told me to document everything and to stay away from Lillian completely. No calls, no texts, no contact. I agreed. But Lillian didn't stay away from me. That Saturday, she showed up at my house with Derek and a woman I didn't recognize, a silver-haired woman in a gray suit who introduced herself as a licensed clinical social worker. She said she was there to conduct a home visit as part of the guardianship evaluation. She had a clipboard and a checklist. She asked to come inside. I told her I had not been notified of any home visit, that my attorney had received no formal notice, and that I would not admit her without proper authorization. She said she had been sent by the court. I asked to see the order. She had no order. She had a letter from Clarissa Webb's office. I closed the door. Through the window, I watched the three of them stand on my porch for several minutes. Lillian was talking rapidly, gesturing toward the house. Derek had his phone out. The social worker looked uncomfortable. Eventually, they left. I called Helen immediately. She told me she would file an emergency motion for a protective order, and she added something that made my stomach go cold. She had received a call from Mark Devereux's office that morning. His preliminary report was complete, and it had been submitted to the court 2 days before the deadline. The report, she had been told, contained findings that were not favorable to my position. I asked her what that meant. She said she was trying to get a copy, but the court had sealed it pending review. Sealed. The investigator I had trained, now working for the firm trying to incapacitate me, had submitted a secret report that I couldn't see, and the judge was reading it without my attorney in the room. But here is the part I haven't told you yet, the part that changed the shape of everything that followed. On Monday morning, I received a letter in the mail from Mark Devereux. Not a legal filing, not a report. A personal letter, handwritten on plain paper, folded into an envelope with no return address. I opened it in my kitchen, standing by the window. It said, "Philip, I need to talk to you. Not on the record. There's something you need to know about the report and about what's coming." I didn't want any of this. Meet me at the Maple Diner on Route 8 Tuesday at noon. Don't tell anyone. Burn this letter after you read it. I didn't burn it. I locked it in my safe. And on Tuesday, I drove to the Maple Diner, the same diner where I'd been eating breakfast for 40 years, and I found Mark Devereux sitting in a corner booth with his back to the wall, looking like a man who had not slept in a week and who was carrying something heavy enough to break him. He didn't stand when I sat down. He just pushed a cup of coffee toward me and said, "They told me if I didn't sign the report they'd written, Catherine would lose her medical coverage." I waited. He spoke for the next hour, and what he told me not only explained the entire case against me, it rewrote everything I thought I knew about the people I had trusted with my life. Mark leaned forward, both hands wrapped around his coffee cup, and told me everything. Clarissa Webb had approached him 6 months earlier, shortly after he opened his private practice. She offered him steady work evaluating guardianship cases, high volume, high dollar, the kind of contracts that would keep Catherine's treatments paid for and their house out of foreclosure. He took the work. He told himself he could stay objective. Then came my case. Clarissa had already prepared a draft report before Mark ever interviewed me. She had written findings that I showed signs of cognitive decline, that my financial decisions were erratic, that I required oversight. She told Mark to review it, sign it, and submit it under his name. When he hesitated, she reminded him that his wife's medical insurance was paid through the consulting agreement with her firm. If he refused, Catherine would lose coverage within 30 days. Mark sat in the diner, his voice steady but his hands trembling, and told me that he had not written the report that the judge was now reading. He had signed it. He had not found me incompetent. The report claimed he had. He had not observed financial mismanagement. The report invented it. And he had not been the one to remove Sandra Okonkwo from my case. That had been Thomas Bracken, the court clerk, at Clarissa's request, because Clarissa knew Sandra was too thorough to accept a pre-written evaluation. I had been targeted before the petition was even filed. I asked Mark why he was telling me now. He said he had spent 2 weeks unable to sleep, that he saw my face every time he closed his eyes, that he had told himself he would make it right. Then he handed me a small digital recorder from his jacket pocket. "This has everything," he said. "My conversation with Clarissa, the threats, the instructions. I recorded our last 3 meetings." He slid it across the table. "Use it, end her." I took the recorder and drove straight to Helen Rankin's office. She listened to the recording in silence. When it finished, she looked at me with an expression I had seen before on lawyers who had just realized they were holding a winning hand. She filed an emergency motion that afternoon for an evidentiary hearing, attaching a sworn affidavit from Mark DeVero recanting his report and a transcript of the recording. Judge Ellison granted the hearing for Thursday, 3 days away. Those 3 days were the longest of my life. I stayed inside my house, not from fear but from discipline. I didn't want any interaction with Lillian or Derek recorded, twisted, or used against me. I ate simple meals. I watered the plants Alina had left on the windowsill. I sat in my study and reviewed every document I had gathered, not because I doubted them, but because I wanted to walk into that courtroom knowing my own life better than anyone else could claim to know it. On Wednesday evening, Helen called with news. Clarissa Webb, upon learning of the motion, had attempted to withdraw as Lillian's counsel. Judge Ellison had denied the withdrawal until after the hearing and had ordered Clarissa to appear. Separately, the court had opened an inquiry into Thomas Bracken's role in the Investigator substitution. The institutional machinery I had once been part of was beginning to turn. I allowed myself a single glass of scotch that night, poured into the glass Alina gave me for our 30th anniversary. Thursday morning, I put on the gray suit I had worn to every jury trial of my career. Helen met me on the courthouse steps. The building was the same one where I had spent 32 years, same marble floors, same high ceilings, same heavy doors that made you feel the seriousness of what happened inside. Judge Ellison's courtroom was on the 3rd floor. When I walked in, Lillian and Derek were already seated at the petitioner's table with a substitute attorney, a young man from Clarissa Webb's firm who looked like he had been handed a grenade and told to hold it steady. Clarissa Webb sat behind them in the gallery, her face pale and rigid. Mark was there too, in a chair against the wall, waiting to be called. The hearing began at 9. Helen presented our evidence in a sequence that built like a case I would have been proud to try. She played the recording of Clarissa's threats. She submitted Mark's affidavit. She called Mark to the stand, and he testified under oath that the report bearing his name was false, that I had answered every evaluation question coherently, that my finances were immaculate, and that he had been coerced. Clarissa's substitute attorney attempted to object, but there was no ground to stand on. Judge Ellison listened without interruption, her expression unreadable, her pen moving steadily across a legal pad. Then Helen called Lillian. Lillian walked to the stand in a dark dress, her jaw set. Helen asked her about the videos shot through my kitchen window. Lillian said they were intended as evidence. Helen asked who had edited them and added the voiceover. Lillian hesitated, then admitted she had done it herself. Helen asked about the bank access attempt from Patricia's city in Arizona. Lillian said she didn't know anything about it. Helen produced a phone record showing 4 calls between Lillian and Patricia on the day of the attempted login, then a text message from Lillian to Patricia that read, "Just try again. It's his mother's maiden name, I'm sure." The courtroom was very still. And then came the moment I had not expected. Derek stood up from the petitioner's table and asked to address the court. Judge Ellison allowed it. Derek walked to the stand, his face ashen, and began to speak. He said that the guardianship petition had been his idea. He had pushed Lillian to pursue it. He had debts, large ones, from failed investments he had hidden from her and from his firm. He owed nearly $400,000 to creditors and had been facing a professional licensing investigation. He had seen my estate as the only solution. He had researched guardianship law. He had found Clarissa Webb. He had coached Lillian on what to say, what to film, what to claim. Lillian, sitting at the table, started to cry. Judge Ellison recessed for 45 minutes. When she returned, she read her ruling into the record. The petition was dismissed with prejudice. Clarissa Webb was referred to the State Bar Association for investigation. Thomas Bracken was to be placed on administrative leave pending a full review. Mark Devereaux, she noted, had committed serious professional violations, but his voluntary recantation and cooperation would be factored into any referral. And regarding me, Philip Carver, the court found no evidence of incapacity, no evidence of financial mismanagement, and no basis for any limitation on my autonomy. I was free. Outside the courtroom, the November light was the same November light I had seen 1,000 times from the windows of this building. Helen shook my hand and said she would send her bill later, with a smile that told me she would send it for exactly her standard rate and not $1 more. I walked to my car and sat in the driver's seat for a long time, watching people cross the courthouse lawn, ordinary people with ordinary problems, unaware that a quiet war had just ended 3 floors above them. 2 weeks later, Lillian came to my house alone. She stood on the porch, the same porch where she had once stood with a clipboard and a social worker, and she asked if she could come inside. I let her. She sat in my living room in the same chair where Mark had sat, and she said she was sorry. Not the kind of sorry people say to get something, but the kind of sorry that sits heavy in a person's chest. She told me Derek had moved out. She told me she was filing for divorce. She told me she had started seeing a therapist. And then she told me something I didn't know. She was pregnant, due in June, and she intended to raise the child alone if she had to. I looked at her, this young woman who had been a girl running through my hallway, who had been led into something ugly by a husband she should have been able to trust, and I saw that she was standing at the edge of a very long fall. I thought about Alina. I thought about what Alina would have done, and I said the same words my son had said to me in the transcript I studied when this whole thing began. I'm not angry. Go home and figure it out, but know that my door is open. She nodded and she left, and I sat in the quiet of the house I had almost lost. Here is the part I did not see coming, the part I only learned months later when the dust had fully settled. Mark Devereaux visited me again in the spring. He had been suspended from practice for a year, and he had accepted it. Catherine's health had stabilized. They had sold their house and moved to a smaller place, and he was working construction for his brother-in-law. He came to thank me for not pushing for criminal charges. And then he told me something that made me put down my coffee and stare at him. That recording I gave you, he said, the one with Clarissa's threats, I didn't just record it because I felt guilty. I recorded it because a week before the diner meeting I received a letter in the mail, no return address. Inside was a photograph of Catherine leaving her oncologist's office and a handwritten note that said, "Do the right thing and we'll help you. Don't, and you'll lose everything." I never found out who sent it. We sat in silence. I thought about the careful handwriting. I thought about my sister-in-law or my neighbor Howard or perhaps Patricia, who had been manipulated but might have found her own way back. I never learned the answer, but I understood in that moment something I had learned over and over during my years as a prosecutor. In the worst fights, you are never fighting alone, even when you think you are. Someone is always watching. Someone is always waiting to do the right thing. I am 71 years old. I live in the house Alina and I bought in 1993. The oak tree in the front yard is taller than the porch roof now. On Sunday mornings, I make coffee in the pot she gave me, and I sit by the window and I watch the light move across the lawn. In June, my step-granddaughter gave birth to a girl she named Alina. I held that child in the same rocking chair where I once held Lillian. The foundation of a life is not built from what you accumulate. It is built from what you refuse to surrender when the pressure comes. I learned that building cases. I learned it again defending my own, and it holds. It still holds. I've thought a lot about why I shared this story. It wasn't for sympathy. I didn't need sympathy. I needed a fair hearing, and I got one. But in the months since that courtroom morning, I've heard from more people than I can count who are facing something like it. A daughter-in-law who decides grandpa shouldn't live alone anymore. A nephew who suddenly shows interest in the house deed. A system that moves fast and asks questions later. It's an epidemic hiding in plain sight, and the people it targets are often the ones least equipped to fight back. Not because they're incapable, but because no one taught them how to build a case for their own lives. The legal machinery around guardianship is supposed to protect the vulnerable, and it does in many instances when the cause is genuine and the motives are clean. But that same machinery can be weaponized. A petition is just a piece of paper. An investigator is just a person with a pen. If the people behind those tools are acting in bad faith, the outcome has nothing to do with competence and everything to do with who tells the better story first. I was fortunate. I knew the playbook. I knew the players. I had the reflexes of a prosecutor and the documentation habits of a man who never threw away a receipt. Most people don't have those advantages. Most people lose before they realize they're in a fight. That is what keeps me awake now, not the memory of Lillian's betrayal, which has softened into something more complicated, but the knowledge that the only thing between autonomy and erasure is often a spiral notebook and the will to use it. Write it down. Every conversation, every date, every strange phrasing. The law runs on evidence. If you have none, you have nothing. If you have it, you have a foundation under your feet when the shaking starts. I'm not going to tell you that family is everything, or that love always wins, or any of the easy endings people reach for, because the real ones are harder. What I will tell you is this: you have the right to your own life. Not to a life that's convenient for someone else, not to a life that pays off someone else's debts, not to a life that gets handed over quietly because fighting is uncomfortable. Your life, your key, your coffee in the morning. Someone will try to convince you that refusing to give it up is selfish. It isn't. Selfish is demanding someone else's home as a solution to your own problems. Boundaries are the load-bearing walls of any human structure. Maintain them, or watch the whole thing fall. If this story meant something to you, share it. Not for me. I've had my day in court. Share it for someone who hasn't yet. Someone who is sitting in a kitchen right now, staring at a letter from a law office, wondering if they have the strength to say no. They do, but they need to know they're not alone. And if you want to see more stories about ordinary people who stood their ground when it mattered, subscribe to this channel. We're telling the ones the system would rather you didn't hear. My name is Philip Carver. I'm 71 years old. I still live in the house Alina and I bought together. Every morning I make coffee in the pot she gave me, and I sit by the window and I watch the oak tree. It's taller than the porch roof now. Strong roots, deep foundation. I plan to be here a long time. Thank you for listening.